So next week we're going to start into the rational Buddhism portion of this series, and which is kind of the heart of this particular program. But before we do that, I wanted to kind of introduce you to something that we'll be working with off and on through the remainder of the meetings, which is Naikan. And because it takes you a little bit of time to kind of get through some stuff, you'll have some homework. It's not mandatory, but it's nice if you do it. It'll give us something to talk about. And it will bring a dimension to this that I think adds a lot to the rational Buddhism portion of what we're doing. And I suggest, if you haven't already done it, I see some copies of the workbook floating around. If you haven't ordered the workbook or downloaded it, I recommend you do that. You can get the PDF on our website. It's free. You can download that. And if you do nothing else before next week, I encourage you to read the first chapter, which is on rational Buddhism, and then the 6th chapter, which is on working with gratitude. And that will kind of keep you caught up to what's going on. So Naikan is a Japanese word that means introspection, basically, looking within. And it's a system of practice that was developed by a Shin Buddhist in Japan in the 19-teens. And it's in the 50s, he started establishing these Naikan centers in Japan where people would go and do these retreats. And then, I guess in probably the 80s or so, it kind of came to the United States. There's one Naikan center in the US, and it's the Trudeau Institute in Vermont, which is where I'll be going this summer to finish up my work on the certificate in Japanese psychotherapy. But Naikan and mudita are kind of related. Mudita is a meditation practice we're going to do. The word means kind of sympathetic joy or appreciation. We'll talk about that a lot more in a couple of weeks. But working with it now will kind of bring a dimension to that work when we get around to doing it that otherwise you wouldn't have. Greg Creech is kind of the Naikan guy in the United States. He's the founder and director of the Trudeau Institute, and he's got a book called Naikan. There's more to it. It's gratitude, grace, and the art of self-reflection. Yeah, thank you. And it's really good. If you really latch onto this and you feel like you're getting a lot out of it, I would encourage you to pick up that book and take a look at that. But basically, the process of Naikan all revolves around 3 questions. What have I received from others? What have I given to others? And what troubles and difficulties have I caused others? So the process with this in retreat is that you'll go in and you'll spend 7 days really asking yourself those questions about a series of people with whom you have relationships. And you start with your mother, traditionally. And they'll go like 7-year increments. You know, how many diapers did she change? Kind of, looking into those details as far as what have I received? And then, what did I give and what trouble did I cause? And I was just thinking about my poor mother. And my experience with this started in the late 1980s. I'd gotten out of one graduate school and was thinking about going into another one, and was kind of checking out psychology as an option, and I sort of casually stumbled across some books on Japanese psychotherapy, and I read about Naikan, and it seemed kind of interesting. So there was no place to go in the US for a retreat at that point, but I worked through the process as it was explained. And when I first saw it, well, this sounds like some kind of la-la, Pollyanna fluffy stuff, but I started digging into it, and I started having some real insights about things. For example, my father was a very difficult person. He was a violent alcoholic, and I grew up with a lot of violence and a lot of trauma in the household and all of that, and he and I had been estranged for some time. But my son had come along, and my father was really wanting to reestablish relationships with me and to meet his grandson. And I wasn't interested. But I started doing this Naikan practice, and went through this whole thing with my mom, and then I went through it with my dad. And I did not want to acknowledge that I had received gifts from him. But the reality was there was quite a bit that I got from my dad. And when it came to what did I give, it was a short list. When it came to what troubles did I cause, it was a fairly long list. So it really kind of helped put that into perspective. I went from seeing my father as this really kind of dark presence in my life that had created a lot of negativity, which granted he had, but putting that into perspective of someone who actually did do a lot of caring actions toward me. Now we didn't start hanging out, but I did start communicating with him and continued to be in touch with him for the rest of his life, and I'm glad that happened. And again, it wasn't it's not like I excused it all and forgive and forget. He was still a difficult person. I still kept him at arm's length. But I was able to let go of a whole lot of that negative feelings that I was carrying around for him after that. So this is the kind of thing that starts happening when we start looking at these questions as they pertain to us and our lives. So one of the interesting things that happens is that when you start asking, what did I get? And start really looking, you find that you're a lot more supported than we naturally tend to think we are. The mind tends to gravitate toward negative things. It's just the way we're wired. But if you sit down and start deliberately paying attention to the ways you're supported, you'll end up being really surprised. So if I think over just the last week or so, what have I got? Michelle has operated the video camera for these things, and she looked up some WordPress templates to make some recommendations for stuff for a website that I'm creating. And I got $150 or so in donations, and I got an honorarium from a Unitarian church, and a bunch of stuff that when you start looking, you realize is there. People in a Vietnamese restaurant brought me some really delicious food. All these kinds of things. And we don't look at the motivation of the giver. It's very typical. We think, well, I was entitled to this. I worked at the Y. That's why they gave me a paycheck. I went to the park and opened it every morning, and that's why the county paid me. We don't look at the motivation. We just look at the fact that we received a gift. Somebody cared about us enough to give us money, all right? And if we want to attribute that to the fact that we have a job, well, they cared about us enough to give us a job. When you start breaking it down that way and realize there's no little things, there's a lot of ways we're supported, then you really start seeing the world in a very different way. So I've said this before, and I will say it several more times before we're done with this. Our experience of life, and whether it's good or bad, has very little to do with what happens to us. And it has almost everything to do with what we're paying attention to. So when we start to pay attention to the support we receive, then we actually change our experience of life. There's a saying in Zen that when you're enlightened, the trees and rocks and grass are enlightened. Well, what this means is that we live in a compassionate world that supports us in a lot of ways. What do we get from the trees and the rocks and that sort of thing? Well, we get firm ground under our feet, and we get shade. We get oxygen, which we have to support life. So we get things just from our environment that make it possible for us to exist. And so working with Naikan this way really helps us to begin to recognize the extent to which that's true. And a clearer picture of our life begins to emerge as a result. So normally we notice inconveniences. And at the same time, we kind of overlook the ways that we inconvenience others and the way we create some problems in our environment. So working with Naikan at this point, as we start to move through metta bhavana and Tonglen and cultivating sympathetic joy and equanimity, we can start to see that it's not all us sending out good stuff, but that we're getting good stuff in return. This metta is not a one-way street. So it enhances our understanding of the Brahma-Viharas that way, but also it makes us a little bit more conscious of what kind of stuff we're putting out there.
Hello everyone. After I finished that talk, we did a Naikan exercise together. And I didn't include that dialogue on the video because you wouldn't have been able to hear a lot of what was said, and because we want to protect the privacy of people who attend Volusia Buddhist Fellowship meetings. But I hope you'll work with this yourself. You get a lot more out of listening to these talks if you try to put this material into practice. So if you go to our website, volusiabuddhist.org, you'll find a tab for the Loving Heart, Peaceful Mind resources page. There's a number of helpful things there, including downloadable guided meditations and some worksheets. You'll see a PDF for the Naikan exercises form, and I encourage you to print that out and try it. You can also access the PDF version of the Loving Heart, Peaceful Mind workbook, and that worksheet and a lot of other useful information are in that workbook. All these downloadable resources are free from our website. However, there's also a link to the e-store where you can buy the print version of the workbook if you'd like that. And of course, book sales help us continue to do the things that we do. I hope you're enjoying these Dharma talks, that you practice this material, and that it helps you to live a fuller, more authentic spiritual life. May your practice benefit all beings.